Hello, my name is Emily Farmer. I'm a student at ECU in the program of Maritime Studies in their grad program, and I came here to talk about the Baldhead Rudder Wreck and La Rosa de Bilbao. So if you've been to the Old Baldy Lighthouse, there's a rudder that's on display there, and that is from a wreck that came off of the Atlantic side of the Baldhead Island, and I will be investigating the identity of this wreck and if the identity of this wreck as Spanish matches what the features of the rudder can tell us. Thank you so much for coming out, and thank you, Old Baldy Foundation, for setting this up. I'm really excited to be here. So my name is Emily Farmer. As Jake mentioned, I'm in the program of Maritime Studies at ECU, and this is my first time on the island, and it's been lovely so far. And it's my first time seeing the rudder, which is on display, and we'll be learning a lot about. So, Baldhead Rudder Wreck was a wreck that was found off of the coast of Baldhead Island over there, and it was named as La Rosa de Bilbao, a Spanish wreck that is known to have wrecked off of this island in 1804. And when I originally heard about this project, my professor was interested in having someone research this wreck because after the excavations in the 1980s, it was never examined again. So there was no follow-up to confirm the identity of this wreck as La Rosa de Bilbao. So we started this project looking mainly at the rudder from a ship construction perspective and seeing how the features of this rudder align with the features of the Spanish ships at this time, and seeing what that can tell us about the Baldhead Wreck, if it is La Rosa de Bilbao or if it's not. And without further ado, we'll get started with this presentation. So to provide a bit of an overview for what we're going to be talking about, I'm going to talk about the discovery of the Baldhead Wreck originally, so how that came to be, who was involved in the project, and then I'll move on to looking at the historical records of La Rosa de Bilbao and how that can inform us about the ship and how it was constructed and how that rudder would have looked. And then we'll move on to the rudder morphology for the rudder that we have in Baldhead Lighthouse. And then finally we'll look at them together and we'll see if the features align. So throughout this presentation, I'll be referring to the Baldhead Rudder Wreck and La Rosa de Bilbao as separate entities, and then by the end of the presentation, we'll bring both of these ships together and see how these features overlap and if they overlap. So to start, this is just a map of Baldhead Island. As most of y'all know, if you live here, this is an island off the coast of North Carolina at the mouth of the Cape Fear, where it's the confluence of the Cape Fear River and the Atlantic Ocean. And off of this island, there's 48.2 kilometers of treacherous sandbars known as the Frying Pan Shoals, which are a navigational hazard and have been for many, many years. It's been the cause of many wrecks in this area. So on this map here, we have about 5 or 6 wrecks that are just known in this small area from this time period. And then specifically, this circle shows where the Baldhead Wreck is located off of the island. So the Baldhead Wreck was originally found in 1987, but there's a story behind how the investigations of this wreck. So the owners of Baldhead Island, Grant and Kent Mitchell, were actually the ones who funded the excavation of this wreck. And they were interested because they had heard rumors of silver coins washing up on the shores of the Cape Fear and of Baldhead Island from a Spanish wreck. And they heard of the La Rosa de Bilbao and were interested in looking for it and finding this wreck. And so they hired Denny Breeze, who was a salvager out of Florida, who's well known with working with Spanish wrecks in the Keys. And he worked with the Divers Strategic Salvers of North Carolina, and I'm not sure if he ran that company. So all this information I'm getting from here is from one of the archaeologists who actually worked on the wreck. So I'm just following the timeline he gave me, but I'm not sure some of the specific details. But basically, Kent and Grant Mitchell went out with Denny Breeze, and eventually in 1987, they found this wreck off of North Carolina, off of the Baldhead Island, and they contacted the North Carolina Underwater Archaeology Branch for permission to excavate this wreck. And with that permitting, some of the archaeologists from the Underwater Branch came out with them, and those archaeologists were Richard Lawrence and Mark Ramsing, who is very well known with work that he's done with the Queen Anne's Revenge. And then we also have Leslie White, who is the person who conserved all these objects. So the rudder that you see on display in the lighthouse, it wouldn't have been on display if he didn't conserve it, because you need to treat these wooden objects that were underwater with specific treatments so they don't deteriorate when they're recovered. And since this wreck is located within the 3-mile radius of Baldhead Island, all of it belongs to the state of North Carolina, so any artifacts they found, they had to turn over to the underwater archaeology branch. So to continue on with this wreck was only looked at for 2 years over a series of dives, and it was designated the title CFI 003, which means it is a wreck within the Cape Fear Inlet, and it is the 3rd wreck that was found in this area that was put into the database. And there were 267 artifacts recovered, and the main feature that was visible when they first found the wreck was a ballast pile, so a pile of rocks that sat at the bottom of the ship. And this was first found on July 30th, 1987. And again, it was the only feature visible on the surface. So when they found this rudder, they had to dig down through layers of sediment to get to it, to excavate it. And this ballast pile is about 60 feet by 20 feet long. So this is the actual drawing of the site plan from the time. So it shows that main ballast pile that I was talking about. We'll see if I can actually see it with the pointer. Oh, no. Yeah, so we have the main ballast pile. It was about 60 feet by 20 feet, and these sort of ballast piles, the ballast sits at the bottom of the ship, so when the ships wreck, the ballast typically preserves what's underneath it because it covers it, and then there's a layer of sediment that comes and it just buries the wood. So if that ballast pile was ever excavated, there's probably some remains of the ship's keel down there, but it basically can tell us information about the size of the vessel because it basically preserves whatever is remaining of the bottom of the vessel. But that wasn't excavated. What they did find, though, was a 16-foot rudder blade, that is the rudder on display, and it was found under 6.1 meters of water, and it was underneath 1.5 meters of mud, so they had to do a bit of excavation to get down there, and they did that in November of 1987, and they excavated it using a prop wash excavator, which is just basically a dredge where you remove the sediment from the sand to get down. And I wanted to talk about the process of how they excavated it because it's really interesting. So they actually created this steel frame here specifically to remove the rudder, and they excavated it and they set up this steel frame on the rudder the day before, and then they actually hooked it up to this barge they rented to remove it from the site and bring it to land. And then they dug a trench in land to place the rudder to keep it waterlocked so it wouldn't deteriorate, and they transferred it over to the underwater archaeology branch at Fort Fisher, where they put it through electrolysis, which is the process of removing salt and water from the rudder itself. And also I recently learned while we were over there that if you sniff the rudder, you can smell the sugar that they use to preserve it. So that's one of the old techniques before these newer processes were discovered, where you preserve an object in sugar and it sucks up the water from it and it keeps it safe, which is very interesting. And then after it was preserved, it was brought to Baldhead Island on loan, and it was put on display at the lighthouse. So to continue the excavation, they were actually supposed to stop excavation after they uncovered the rudder, but when they were trying to fill in the hole they made when they pulled the rudder out, they accidentally found a cannon. So they also had to pull up the cannon. So we found a 9-pounder cast iron cannon that was also recovered and preserved at the underwater archaeology branch. And a 9-pounder cannon is basically the amount of shot that it carried. The ball itself was 9 pounds. And this is a pretty big cannon, so these are actually from this time period known as chaser cannons. So they'd be set either on the stern or the bow of the ship, and they'd have either other cannons on the side, or there'd just have that one main cannon. I wanted to bring this cannon up because it's an interesting diagnostic feature for the ship, because it's actually a British cannon. So these markings on the ship, or on the cannon, they tell you information about where the cannon was from, the size of the cannon, and when it was proved and when it was made and things like that. So we actually have the markings K and W, which mean that it was made by George Knott, who was a founder at Woolwich Arsenal in England. And we have the date 1789, which was the date the cannon was first cast. And then we have a second date, which is 1796, which is the date the cannon was proofed for use. So to proof a cannon, they would basically just test the shot to make sure that when you use the cannon, it's not going to explode on you. So it's a good date to have because we know whatever vessel that the Baldhead Rudder Wreck is, it was at least operating in this area by 1796. So moving away from the Baldhead Wreck, I want to start talking about La Rosa de Bilbao. So this ship in the historical records is also referred to as Santa Rosa, San Rosa, La Rosa, El Bilbao, and Bilbao. It has a lot of names. And the name La Rosa de Bilbao was first used to refer to the Baldhead Rudder Wreck on July 30th, 1987. And it was first publicly named in this article here on November 8th, 1987, where it says that salvagers this week will seek the pieces of history and perhaps gold when they dive to a Spanish galleon that sank in 1804 amid reports of a murderous mutiny by its treasure-hungry crew. So we'll dive into that in a minute, but these reports that it was called La Rosa de Bilbao and were both done before there were any actual excavations of the site. So these were both made before the rudder was actually recovered. And we have this thing in archaeology which is called ruling theory. So this is the idea that there is preconceived notions of what a site is based on the researchers and what they're looking for. So the reason why we wanted to bring this up in relation to this wreck is because we have these sort of terminologies that are used in these newspapers, like treasure-hungry crew and gold, when there's never been gold in reference to the Rosa de Bilbao documented. And we also have the tendency for researchers or institutions to compromise their objective interpretation of the data, which if we have these people coming to this wreck and specifically looking for silver Spanish coins, then they will want to find the wreck and they will want to give that identity to it. And the reason why, I didn't know if that cut out, but the reason why we were curious about this wreck is because we have this identity given to it before the excavation happened. And we really wanted to investigate that and see if it matched what it is given. And the idea, why would ruling theory be at play here? With Spanish wrecks, you often have the trouble with treasure, is what we've been calling it, which is the idea that general public often perceive these sort of wrecks as being associated with pirates and being filled with lost silver, gold, and jewels, and therefore it makes them more valuable and more sought after in the commercial diving world. And like I said, the terminology here, we have the treasure-hungry crew and the gold on the wreck, where gold has never been mentioned. So continuing on, we have what is being said about the wreck, and then we have the actual facts that we have found from the historical records. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the wrecking event, that for the information we know about the wreck of La Rosa de Bilbao. So we have mentions of a treasure-hungry crew. So what actually happened? So the first record I have states that a Spanish merchantman, which is just a general term to refer to a ship that was carrying merchant goods, that the ship Santa Rosa with Captain Fernandez, sailing from Havana to Bilbao with a great amount of treasure aboard, was lost near Wilmington about the middle of November. And this is the only reference that I have that states that there was actually treasure aboard, and this was made in 1975, way after the ship had wrecked. And then I have another record that's actually from November 1804 that says the ship Santa Rosa with Captain Fernandez from Havana bound to Bilbao with a cargo of 1,616 boxes of sugar, having sprung a leak and attempting to make this port, was cast away on the frying pan on Thursday last. The crew, in 24 in number, were all saved, and the ship and cargo were entirely lost. So now we have mentions of sugar shipment. And those are continued mentioned in other records from the time that says the ship, the Bilbao now, so it was referred to as Santa Rosa before, but now it's the Bilbao, appeared off of Fort Johnson during the storm, and the crew, 20 men, were arrested by Lieutenant John Fergus, commander of Fort Johnson at the time, by the blockhouse under suspicion of having murdered their captain and mate at sea. So the crew was then sent to Charleston for trial, where they were released due to lack of testimony against them. So now we have the sugar, and we also have this tale of mutiny, where there's still not a lot of information about it, but apparently the captain and the first mate had passed away at sea due to some circumstances, and the facts are that the crew ran the ship aground. They either ran it aground or it wrecked during a storm. That's still not clear. But they were brought to Charleston and they were released due to lack of evidence. And there's also a fun line in here that there were 21 members of this crew, a villainous looking set of rascals that I had no doubt they were. So continuing on, this is the American side, so this is what we have on the North Carolina side, so we're moving on to what we have in the Spanish records. So Grant Mitchell actually went out to Bilbao, Spain in 1988 to conduct research on La Rosa de Bilbao, and he went to the Archive of Indies, but in Sable, but he didn't find any records. And this is important because that means that the ship wasn't carrying any government cargo, because that's what would make it part of the Archive of the Indies. He did go to Bilbao, but the records in that area were flooded at the time, but they did give him a history of the shipping in Bilbao book that gave us a little bit of information. So these two reports I have here are confirmed reports of Bilbao. I don't have any confirmed references to the ship before 1804, but these are just possible shipping logs from ships that could be the Bilbao. So we have reference in 1779 to the El Bilbao with the captain Antonio de Aristida, who did go to Havana, and he did carry sugar back. And we also have reference to the Bilbao by the same captain going to Havana and going to Havana again. So it's located in the same area, it has a similar name. It might be the same ship, we don't know. There's no way to confirm, but actually preparing for this presentation, I found a couple more records from different areas. So this is a reference from the same book that talks about a ship called the Rosa, but we have the same name for the captain. So we have P.M. Fernandez. So we know it's the same ship now. These are records from 1804 that says the ship went to Martin and that it also went to Bristol and Hull. So knowing that it went to Bristol now, we can go look at the shipping records from Bristol. And then I found another ship called the La Rosa with the Captain Fernandez. And this report is very exciting because it gives us a lot of information about the ship. So we have reference to the ship as a brig, which is this number here on the far left over the S. So in the Spanish records, which I'll talk about a little later, the ship is referenced as a fragata or a frigate, but in this record they have it referenced as a brig, but this is because in the British records they didn't have a specific ship title for frigates listed on their key log for when they brought the ships in, but it still can tell us information because a brig is basically talking about how the rigging of the ship is different from the other vessel. The brig is basically a schooner that is rigged differently, is what I was told. So we can tell from that it was likely a two-masted vessel and that it was likely rigged with square sails, or square sails as they're called. And then we have that it was 290 tons, which is really interesting because that gives us information about the sugar. So technically, if it was loaded to full capacity, each of those 1,616 sugar crates would be about 400 pounds each, which does make sense, but it's just, we don't have the records from Havana, so we don't know for sure how much each of those crates weighed. But the tonnage is really important because it tells us how much the vessel is carrying, and that means it can tell us how big the hull of the vessel was, which can tell us some more information about the size of the ship. We have that there were actually some repairs done to the ship during this time. There were repairs done to the side, and we also have that the ship was made of pine. We don't know what type of pine, and also pine is a very interesting material for ships because it's a softwood, so it tends to deteriorate faster, but it does mention that the ship is also sheathed, which is metal that they put around the hull of the ship or the waterline, below the waterline, to protect the ship from shipping worms. We also have that it went to Bilbao and that it came back from Bilbao to go to Bristol. We have that the draft of the ship is 13 feet, so that's how low the ship sits in the water when it's completely full. And then we have that it came here in April. So we're establishing a timeline of 1804 of the ship's final year of the activities and where it's gone. So we have that it went to Bristol in April, and then this record below it is a Spanish record I found of its time in Veracruz. So we have that the ship left for Havana, and there was the frigate Rosa with the captain Maria Fernandez, and that when it left Veracruz, it actually had about 7,000 gold pesos and 16,000 gold pesos and 7,000 silver pesos, which was very interesting to find after all of that. But I think the progression of this is that the ship originally left Bilbao with a shipment of goods that it took to Veracruz, that it then traded with Veracruz to get this money, which it then took to Havana to buy the 1,616 boxes of sugar, which it then wrecked with. So I'm not sure how much of that was on board at the time, because most of it would have been used to pay for the sugar shipment. But this is showing that the ship was in Veracruz in August, so we know it was likely in Havana around September, and then it wrecked in November. Continuing on, these are more of the established records we have. So we know that Fernandez was associated with the ship now called Bilbao, one of its many names. And then afterwards, we have a record from 1800s to 1804 that says the following ships continued this course of treatment. And it references La Rosa de Bilbao, a frigate with Captain Fernandez, that it went to Veracruz and Havana, and that it wrecked off the coast of Carolina, referencing North Carolina. So, going back to the sugar crates again, this was the original math I did when I first was doing this project, and I didn't have that record because I found the record of the tonnage of the ship 2 days ago. So, based on the average weight of sugar boxes exported from Havana around this time period, these boxes were documented to be around 450 pounds each. And using that and the amount of sugar, we can, and the tonnage of the time with the tons and what they equaled at the time, we can make an estimate that the frigate itself carried a shipment of about 325 tons. So I now know that number's wrong, but I was close at least. So we know that its full capacity is now 290 tons, but we don't know if they overfilled the ship. We don't know anything about how much those sugar crates actually weigh. This is just an estimated number that I came up with to look at the types of vessels that operated at the time. And this other part was also done before I knew it was a frigate, so this is just a bunch of random math that I had to do. But I went through a ton of Spanish archives and I found out that the only vessels that operated and traded with Havana at that time that could account for a tonnage between 290 and 325 were frigates and packet boats. So trade in Havana between 1717 and 1778 saw 1,029 frigate voyages between 157 frigates in total, with 30 of those frigates being Spanish. On the other hand, there were 231 packet boat voyages in Havana in total, which was between 26 packet boats, with only 3 being identified as Spanish in origin. So based on this, it made sense that the vessel was likely a frigate, and then those historical documents confirmed that identification. So we have the identity of La Rosa de Bilbao as a frigate. We have that its home port is in Spain, Bilbao, Spain. We have that it was captained by Felicia Maria Fernandez. It has a tonnage of 290, has a draught of 13 feet. It wrecked in North Carolina. And when it wrecked, it was carrying sugar, and its captain and first mate died at sea for some mysterious reason, and that it wrecked on the Frying Pan Shoals, and the crew was detained in Charleston and was released after no evidence could be found against them. And then for the timeline of its final year, we have that it went to Marte. We don't know when. Later on, it was at Bristol, and between that time and Veracruz, it went to Hull in England at some point. We have that it was in Veracruz, and it was leaving Veracruz on August 13th. Then it went to Havana, we don't know when. And then finally, we have that November 8th, 1804, it wrecked in North Carolina. So those are the established facts we have for La Rosa de Bilbao. So let's talk about what we know about the rudder and how those facts can relate to each other. So before we start, I want to talk about the parts of the rudder so it's a little less confusing when the main construction of the rudder, and what we have here on this image on the left is we have a rudder blade, which is what was used to cut through the water and to help navigate the ship. And then at the very top, where we have that little broken piece, that is known as the rudder stock, and that is the part or the piece of timber that is made up of the rudder that continues upward into the ship and connects to whatever steering mechanism they were using at the time, whether it was connected to the rigging and the wheel or it was connected to a tiller. We also have the stern post, which makes up the stern of the ship or the back of the ship, and that locks into the keel. And the stern post is what the rudder locks into. And to allow it to move, we have pintles, which are these little bands on the rudder. Let's see if I can point. Like there's a pintle up in this area up top, and then there's another pintle down here. And these are basically hinges that allow it to lock into matching hinges on the stern post, which are called gudgeons. So that's what allows the rudder to rotate and to steer the ship. We also have the heel or the foot of the rudder, which is basically just the bottom part of the rudder, and that's what would sit on parallel with the keel or the bottom of the ship. We have the rake of the rudder. So the rake is basically how tilted the stern post is, which shows how far out the rudder is sitting. We have the leading edge, which is this edge on the right side. So that's basically the edge that was closest to the stern post, and then the trailing edge is the edge that's trailing behind it, so the part that's following it. And then, of course, rudders from these times were sheathed, and it depends on what material they used. They could use iron, they could use copper, but that was basically to protect it from shipworms and from worms deteriorating and other organisms deteriorating the wood of the rudder, because if your rudder is gone, then you can't navigate and you're basically stuck in the water. And then fasteners are basically, if you look on the rudder out there, there's a ton of little iron nails, and that was what would be used to hold the sheathing onto the rudder. And yeah. So moving on, like I said, it's a 16-foot blade. It's very tall. And like the rake I talked about, it has a very strong aft rake. Oh, it's coming out. So that means that the stern post of the rudder is very, very angled. Sometimes the ships have a stern post that sticks straight up, but this one has a very strong angle. And if you see how the bottom of this rudder is kind of a triangle here, that would have sat flat on the ground or flat in the water. So that just shows that rudder was tilting, had that long angle. And we have these two pintle straps. So these are the pieces of the rudder that lock into the gudgeons. So these are what allow the rudder to pivot on a hinge. And we also have a repair that was made to the rudder that I'll talk about later, but you can see it if you look when you're there. It is a piece of wood that is much lighter, and it just means that the rudder was damaged at some point and they had to fix it. And then there are also the remnants of the copper sheathing that we see. And these are all the measurements that were taken when they originally found it. I'm not going to bore you with all those details because it's a lot, but I do have measurements for the width of the rudder. And all of this information is basically saying that further down the rudder, you can see that it is shaped, so it'll cut through the water better, and then you see that it becomes thicker as you go up because it needs that support. And these are just images showing the shape of the rudder. So you can see the bottom, it's very narrow, it's very thin, and then the top is much thicker, and that's where that rudder stock would be. So that's where it would connect to the steering mechanism on the ship. And then here are some more pictures from the recovery, so you can see that angled shape. And then the next thing I wanted to talk about, the next diagnostic feature, is copper sheathing. So like I mentioned, there are many types of sheathing. You can have copper, you can have iron. There was also originally wood sheathing, which was called sacrificial planking, that would be put on these sort of bottom of the ship to protect it from deterioration. So it'd be sacrificed to protect the important planking. But copper sheathing specifically originated through experiments done around the 1760s. And the rudder shows remnants of copper sheathing that would have covered the entire hull of the vessel. And yeah, so it was first introduced in the 1760s, and then by the 1780s, the British contractors began to sell copper fastenings and fittings to all the naval powers in Europe. So it originated in England, spread across Europe, and then eventually it went to the Americas in 1790s. And then by that time, by the 1850s, the Americans began to use their own copper that they found in mines in Pennsylvania. And then we have the limitation of copper sheathing with the introduction of Muntz metal in the 1830s, which is a copper zinc alloy. So that means that we really have a timeline between the 1760s, which is pretty early, to the 1830s, where copper sheathing is very popular in these sort of shipping lanes. So I'd say that this vessel was probably sheathed around the 1780s, 1790s, because we have that date from the canon as well, that we have 1796, the ship was active, so it's likely that it was probably sheathed around the 90s. And these ships are typically sheathed up to the waterline, and if you look at the rudder, there's actually an angled impression that you can see in the box here that actually lines up with the angle of the foot of the rudder. So this angle would actually be parallel with the ground if the rudder was sitting directly at the angle it was supposed to be. And I think that might be where the water line is. And that's about 3.3 meters up. I didn't have a specific measurement, but it's just an interesting fact to note. When the rudder was first examined, there was also 2 wood samples taken, and they were sent to the University of Florida. And these samples tell us that the rudder was made of white oak, and that there was also that repair that I mentioned, it was made of pine. So this is the main structure of the rudder blade here. You have the white oak, and with white oak, you can't really separate it from Old World or New World species because you can't, it's located in both areas, but you can't separate it between if it's white oak or red oak. So this was specifically identified as white oak, and white oak was a mainstay in North American ship construction. It's a hardwood, meaning that it is hardy and that it is less susceptible to worms and things eating it. It's very strong. It was used in most major ships for the keels, like the important parts of the ship, like the rudder. And it was a mainstay in North American ship construction prior to the introduction of steel. And then we have this repair here, which you can actually see it's a completely different color from the rest of the rudder. And yellow pine is interesting, specifically because there's 7 subgroups, and the archaeologists who investigated it identified it specifically as loblolly pine, which is completely native to Southeast North America. So its native range is through those bottom 14 states of the East Coast, and it seems to be a repair done to the rudder after the fact. I just looked at it, and there's actually an iron spike that goes through this repair piece that connects it to the rest of the rudder, which I think was done when they did repair it. But this subgroup Tata, or the loblolly pine, is just saying that whatever repair was done, it was done in America at some point on the East Coast. So we have all this information about the La Rosa de Bilbao, we have all this information about the Baldhead Rudder Wreck that we've gotten from the rudder. What can this tell us about the morphology of the ship? So what can the shape of the rudder tell us about the rest of the ship? So based on the dimensions and the appearance of the rudder, historical ship plans of vessels common in the North American colonies between the 1770s or 1700s and the 1885 were analyzed for similarities to the Baldhead Wreck. And what I found when I was researching these ships is that there's a very strong rake that I mentioned that's common in these really early American vessels during after the Revolutionary War, and that the 2 vessel types I found that were most common to the rudder are the Virginia-built pilot boat schooners and Virginia-built Baltimore schooners. And there's also British vessels that you can investigate, but we'll start off with the Virginia-built pilot boat schooners. So, Virginia-built is basically just a general term that was used at the time to define any schooner that was over 16.7 meters or more, regardless of the trade the vessel was involved with. So Virginia-built doesn't mean it was actually built in Virginia. It's likely just built along the East Coast. These ships right here were mainly influenced by the Bermuda sloops, which were an earlier vessel that operated in the Chesapeake Bay, trading from Bermuda. We don't actually have any known wrecks of these ships or like known reports of these actual ships, so we don't know what they actually looked like. But there was also an influence with these pilot boats from the shark schooners that appeared under the French flag, and they were defined by this round forefoot you see here. So the front of the vessel is the forefoot, it's rounded, and then they're also defined by having a long straight keel and then that really strong rake of the stern post and the rudder, with the rudder having more area deep down, more shape than at the waterline. So they're much thinner deep down and wider than they are at the top, where they're much thicker and thinner, thicker and stouter. And these vessels were very fast, successful privateers that were able to weather out the severest weather they were exposed to, and were defined by the necessity for possessing very fast vessels in these early colonial periods. So these strong rakes of the rudder and this rounded forefoot allow them to cut through the water much easier which again is just necessity when you're having fast vessels in these shallow shoal areas. And by the mid-18th century, these vessels averaged out a length of 18.2 meters, with even longer vessels appearing after this period. And this pilot boat here is the schooner Swift, that was 14.9 meters long, with a 3.04 meter rudder blade. And this vessel was actually later taken in by the British and adopted into the British Navy. So this is the other type of vessel. Oh, I forgot to mention, I have the rudder on this left side laid out, so how it would sit on the stern post of the ship, so you can compare it to how it is sat on the pilot boat schooner. And something that's interesting with this rudder that I didn't see with a lot of these ships that I was looking at is that pintle I mentioned, there's a bottom pintle, and it's very, very close to the foot of the rudder. You can see it's pretty much touching it. And that is something I really only saw on these two vessel types, but again, it was a very preliminary study, and there's definitely a lot more out there. But it's just something interesting to know. And then you can also see the rudder laid out as it would sit on the stern post beside this Virginia-built Baltimore schooner. So Baltimore schooners actually originated during the Revolutionary War, and were also often referred to as this term Virginia-built, with the vessel's type existence being centered on the necessity for fast, seagoing, and heavily armed ships, which led to these vessels being actually larger than the Virginia pilot boats. And these vessels actually later evolved into the Baltimore clippers, which are very well known in ship construction. And Baltimore schooners typically started around 22 meters in 1775 and gradually increased in size and number during the latter years of the war and continued to be constructed after. And this ship here is the Nonpareil, which was 28.67 meters long with a 6.7 meter rudder. So these rudder measurements, and there's also this British ship. So this was the original ship that was used in the documentation of La Rosa de Bilbao and the Baldhead Wreck in that original site file. They were interested in looking at this ship more. I didn't get a chance to investigate it too much, but they just showed that it was a ship that had two pintles that showed similarities to the Baldhead Wreck. So this is the Duchess of Manchester, which is a sloop that was constructed in 1777 and later was adopted into the British Navy as well. So in both of these vessels I talked about, the Swift and Nonpareil, so the Baltimore schooners and the Baltimore pilot boats, the steering mechanism, which is what we're missing from the Baldhead rudder, made up about 30% of the total rudder length. So if we use this percentage to estimate the length of the steering mechanism for the Baldhead rudder, we could say that it was missing about 1.5 meters, which means we could say the total length of the rudder would be about 6.3 meters. And this Baldhead rudder, based on the construction of these ships and the morphology of the rudders, would have likely been to attach to a smaller vessel meant for speed as compared to a larger vessel meant for cargo, like the La Rosa de Bilbao. And it likely was probably a vessel between 80 and 100 feet based on the dimensions of the rudder and the size of the ballast pile. And if we assume the same rudder to ship length ratio that the Nonpareil has, we can assume that the ship could have possibly been around 88 feet, so a little bit closer to 90 feet. And other applicable vessel types at the time that we were looking at also included brigs, which I said they're differently rigged schooners, so it's just saying that the rigging of the ship is different. And then sloops, which are typically one-masted vessels, which I think is probably less likely. It likely had two masts. And then the final step is comparing it to the Spanish frigate. So we have the identity of La Rosa de Bilbao as a frigate. What do Spanish frigate rudders look like? So, Spanish frigates, the first two frigates appeared in the 1730s, with the first generation of frigates being smaller than those that were built after the 1800s. So the average length of these frigates was typically about 30.5 meters, and they typically range between 100 and 300 tons, which we have La Rosa de Bilbao as 290 tons, so it fits within that range. This keel length here is longer than the proposed length of the Baldhead Rudder Wreck itself, so it doesn't match the size of the ship based on the ballast pile, based on the size and construction of the rudder. We also have the rudder size, so it's completely different. You can see here there's a couple examples of what these rudders look like. They're a lot more straight. You have that very straight stern post, and ships with a straighter stern post typically have a boxier shape for the cargo hold, so it's just allowing more stability for the heavier weight that it's going to be carrying. It's not meant to be really rigged to cut through those coastal waters and things like that of North Carolina and Virginia. We also have a feature that you see on a lot of European ships at the time, which is called the skeg, which if you look at the rudder here, you see there's a little divot on the bottom right, and that's what the skeg is called. So it's just an extension of the keel into the rudder, and it just adds support because the rudder is a big steering mechanism. You need support of that size. So here's just a better picture of what our rudder looks like. So how it is angled and how it would be sat on the ship versus how rudders from Spanish vessels at that time period look. So you can see that the features don't really match. We don't have anything that typically aligns it to what typical frigates from the time look. So in summary, this is just talking about what we've talked about. We have material analysis. So that places the provenience of the wreck between the late 18th century and the early 19th century. So we have that copper sheathing, which says that this wreck would exist at least by the 1780s forward, unless it was a very early sheathed vessel. We have the Munz metal, which is the copper zinc alloy that they would sheath after the 1830s. So we have that sort of limit. We don't know how long it would have been operating or when that would have been sheathed, but we have a somewhat limit by the 1830s. We have a cannon that was recovered from the wreck that was proved in 1796, which states that the wreck was at least operating by that time. And we have the rudder similarities to vessels from the time period. So we have those two vessel types. We have the Virginia-built schooners, the Virginia pilot boats, the wood samples with the white oak and loblolly. Those are common wood construction materials of vessels in the early coastal Americas. We also have that pintle distance to the foot of the rudder. It's very close, which I didn't see on a lot of vessels, but we do see it on those early Virginia-built vessels. You have that really, really strong rake that is necessary for speed and fast vessels that you use in these coastal environments. And then you have the similarity in the appearance and length. And then we have the Spanish frigate, La Rosa de Bilbao. It has the tonnage of 290, which this rudder, don't believe, could support. We have the keel length of these frigates from this time, which is longer than the proposed length of the wreck. And then we also have the shape. It's completely different. As you see, there's different amounts of pintles. The rig is very straight. It's much wider, thicker. We also have the skeg, which we don't have in our ship construction. So it shows that these types of frigates, these types of ship construction, this type of rudder that you see on the Rosa de Bilbao, it would likely be meant for a ship of cargo, as compared to the ship meant for speed, which we see in the rudder we have here. So conclusions, it can be proposed that the Baldhead rudder was likely attached to some sort of vessel that operated in the early coastal America. Probably Virginia built. It could be Virginia built, it could be British, we don't know. Just that it was probably operating by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. I talked to the UAB, the Underwater Archaeology Branch, and they gave me a list of known shipwrecks in the area. And there are 66 known historical wrecks at the mouth of the Cape Fear just from 1777 to 1824. So that's just showing that there are so many wrecks in this kind of environment, and that this environment is so conducive to wrecks that we really just, I don't think we'll ever be able to identify it. We're not sure what it is, we will try, but within this time period, there are 22 vessels that are applicable to what we know about the Baldhead Rudder Wreck. So there's 9 brigs, which are the differently rigged schooners. We have 7 schooners, we have 2 sloops, 1 ship, and 3 unknown vessels. And this is part of the future work, which will be to look at the material culture and to look at this list of ships and see if we can find anything that aligns and if any of these shipping records match what we know about the wreck. And all this information, it's not to say conclusively that the Baldhead Rudder Wreck is not La Rosa de Bilbao, but it's just as likely to represent a vessel that was Virginia built or British from this time period based on the evidence provided just from the rudder analysis. If extensive archaeological work had been done to follow up the rudder, we would have known a little bit more that there are numerous factors that bring to light the identity of this wreck as a Spanish vessel, which it had been publicly and archaeologically reported to be for decades. And this is just to say that jumping to conclusions when identifying a site, one encounters that subjectivity that can cloud archaeological perceptions, and that it's instead important that shipwrecks and their contents are assessed and studied objectively so that for whatever the final identification, if any, the maximum amount of useful information is extracted.
Thank you.